Now here in our main function, we ask the user to enter the width of a rectangle. Then we create a rectangle object and set its width. Now, if we run this program and enter a negative value for the width, our program terminates with an uncaught exception. So our program crashed, and this is not a good user experience. A better approach is to properly catch and handle exception. So here we can show an error message to the user and say the width is invalid. To do that, we put the line that might throw an exception inside a try block. So here we type try followed by braces and move this line up here. Now, a try block in the middle of a function is kind of ugly. While not necessary, it would be much cleaner to put this entire code inside the try block. So I'm going to move the try statement up here and indent all these lines. That's better. Now we know that somewhere in this function, one or more of these lines might throw an exception. Okay? Now, immediately after the try block, we type a catch block. And here we can catch the exception object that we throw in this method. So here we type parentheses and specify the type of exception, in this case, invalid argument. So this is the type, and here we're essentially declaring a parameter. So we give this parameter a name. Quite often we use E or X, whatever you prefer. Now, if this line throws an exception, control moves to this block. So what we put after will not get executed. Let me show you. So if we print done on the console, we're not going to see this. So let's run the program and enter -1. All right, we don't see done on the console, but we see destructor called. Now we added this earlier. We don't really need a destructor for this rectangle. So let me comment out this line. It's right here. Okay, so back to our catch block. What are we going to do here? We're going to print an error and say invalid width. So let's run the program one more time. -1. Okay, now we have an error message, and this is much better than letting the program crash, but we're not done yet. We don't want to hard code an error message like this. Earlier I told you that an exception object contains information about the error. So let's remove the width from here and use chaining. Now this exception object has a method called what, which returns a constant character pointer. This is a C-style string. We talked about it in the previous part of this course. Now what it returns here is the string that we passed to the constructor of this exception class. So if we run the program, we see the same result as before, but we haven't hard-coded the error message in our main function. That is an improvement. But we don't even have to print invalid here. We can have this exception object contain the actual error message. So I'm going to modify this method, and here we're going to type a descriptive error message. So the width cannot be negative. Okay, I forgot an and. Good. All right, back to our main function. Now we get rid of this and simply rely on the error message stored in this exception object. Now take a look. All right, the width cannot be negative. Much, much better. Now we're not done yet. So here we have a little warning saying catch handler catches by value, should catch by reference instead. So the exception object that we created over here gets passed to this catch block. Now, because we are not using a reference parameter, that exception object is copied by value. And you know that this is not a good idea. So it's better to use a reference parameter here and also make it a constant because we don't want to change this exception object in this block. Now the warning goes away. Now, one thing you should be careful about in the catch block is that the code that you put here should never throw an exception. So if I create a rectangle here and set the width to -1, this catch block will throw an exception and there is no other catch block to catch this exception. So if you run the program, our program will crash again. So always pay attention to what you put in a catch block. Your code should be absolutely safe and free of exceptions. So this is how we can catch exceptions. Now earlier I told you that if this line throws an exception, the rest of the try block is not executed and control moves to the catch block. So here we catch the exception and now control continues. So whatever we add here will get executed. So if you say end of program, this will be printed on the terminal. There you go.